The final bastion of coal power in Oregon is no more. It's the end of an energy chapter as renewable sources prepare to take the front seat. But can wind, solar, and hydropower fill the gap left behind with coal now in the rearview mirror?
Transmission, we are quite concerned about whether we have enough time to be able to address this issue.
The backstory of the Boardman plant and where we go from here. Here's the story.
I'm Christine Pitawanich in for Pat Doris tonight. Welcome to The Story. So you may not have heard the boom, but something pretty big fell today. It was the last standing symbol of coal power in Oregon, and that's why it's tonight's big story. This morning, demolition crews blew up the coal power plant in Boardman, Oregon. The town sits in Morrow County along the Columbia River and I-84. Portland General Electric decommissioned the plant back in 2020, which is when the death toll for coal sounded for the first time here in Oregon. And today, it was time for the infrastructure for burning coal to come crashing down. Evan Watson was there as it fell.
A 656-foot tall stack is now in pieces. The demolition of Oregon's last standing coal power plant is, of course, symbolic of a shift in energy sources.
This plant, whether you're against coal or not, this plant has played a vital role in Oregon and in the West in general.
In just 20 seconds, the Boardman coal plant collapsed. The plant, a longtime staple of the power grid, started providing electricity to Oregonians in 1980. Portland General Electric shut it down in 2020, spending the last 2 years cleaning it out and salvaging parts before this demolition.
The coal plant has been just a workhorse of the fleet for 40 years. But if you look around the landscape here, we've got lots of clean, renewable energy sources coming in, and we're transitioning, and this is just part of that transition.
A group of former workers and county residents watched the stack fall, reflecting on what this plant meant to their rural community in eastern Oregon. Don Russell is a Morrow County commissioner.
For me, when I look out my house to the south, I see the coal stack. And so I know which way south is because I can see the coal stack.
He says many of the former coal plant workers retired. Others got new jobs with PGE, and some lost work.
For Morrow County, at one time, this plant was our largest taxpayer by a really large margin. Since the 40 years since it's opened, Morrow County has grown some and diversified our economy a little bit. But still, the roughly 125 permanent jobs that they had out here were really coveted jobs in Morrow County.
PGE Vice President of Utility Operations Brad Jenkins was a plant manager here.
And the plant in and of itself is just another plant. A lot of wire, a lot of tubes, a lot of equipment. The people made this plant.
Shutting down Boardman is representative of the company's shift to renewable energy sources like wind and solar power. Jenkins said they need more to replace the reliability of coal.
So as we look to the next generation of emission-free sources, we'll have to add more to replace a resource like this.
And then you ask the people who built it.
George Gritz.
In the 1970s.
G-R-I-T-Z.
Piece by piece.
Not S, no.
Get that S out of here.
That's in the cereal department. I'm in.
George Gritz and Dave Aldrich both worked union jobs building the Boardman plant.
There's a lot of work put into it, and it didn't take very long to bring her down. Came down fast. Kind of sad. Kind of sad to see that much infrastructure wasted, because it was still a functioning plant when they shut it down.
PGE closed the plant in response to environmental lawsuits and consumer demand. The company wants to be greenhouse gas emission free by 2040. Jenkins says PGE still has plans for this land. The infrastructure for power transmission is still there.
But clearly we would like to see another resource in the region.
Solar panels would be the most likely replacement, and Gritz and Aldrich would be just fine with that.
I hope another one comes along.
Going to be a massive solar farm out here, I hope.
Evan Watson, KGW News.
Astounding how fast that comes down. So today's demolition was something that was really in the works for years. Now it is finally done. A chapter of energy production here in Oregon officially closed for good. No more coal will be burned here to create electricity. But just how much pollution came from that plant? And how did it all work? Pat Doris visited Boardman back in 2019, and he shows us how we got here.
The Boardman coal plant did pump out between 1.5 and 2 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, all of it invisible. That made it the single biggest point of greenhouse pollution in Oregon. But it's also tiny when you consider worldwide carbon emissions from coal plants in 2018 totaled 10 gigatons. That's 10 billion metric tons. Isn't that just a drop in the ocean?
Well, you might think about a drop in the ocean, but the ocean is comprised of drops, right? And so when you think about the entirety of the nation's coal fleet, it's pretty significant to have the only coal plant that exists in Oregon to be coming offline.
And a coal plant is comprised of tons of coal. Boardman burned a special low sulfur coal to cut down on pollution. The plant went through lots of it, 5.5 tons a minute when it was running. Boardman typically had 500,000 tons on the ground waiting to burn. You can see there, especially on the left side of the picture, it's nearly all gone now. The coal was brought in using trains 100 cars long from the Powder River Basin mines in southeast Montana and northeast Wyoming. When you hold it, it feels surprisingly light, sort of like pieces of burned wood left over in a fireplace. Inside the plant, machines pulverize it into a fine powder. Then it's sprayed into a boiler, it's a big furnace, where it burns and heats water up above. The heated water turns into steam, which spins a turbine that turns a generator and makes electricity. When the plant was running full out, as it was when I toured in 2019, it created enough power for 500,000 homes each moment that it's running. Now that power source is gone.
It's a big gap to fill, but it is one that we're confident that we can fill, both in terms of the near term, the resources that we've got lined up now, and over that longer term as well.
PGE will buy extra hydropower over the next 5 years to replace that lost coal power. It's still working on what happens after that. Boardman is the first but not the last coal plant to close in the West. Over 8 years, 12 plants will shut down, taking down enough dependable coal electricity to power 3.8 million homes. Instead, the power companies will rely on renewable resources, which will be good for the environment, but not nearly as dependable.
And that leads us to power reliability. It's something so many of us take for granted. I mean, just look at the public safety power shutoffs that happened last week when those wildfires were such a huge threat. Dozens of you emailed and called us upset about losing power. You told us things in your freezers spoiled, and you were understandably frustrated. But in the coming years, as coal goes away in our region, will the renewable sources we're left with be enough to keep the lights on whenever we need them? We're not going to sugarcoat this because there are some very concerning power models out there that say there is a decent chance that our power sources won't be enough after coal is gone. In 2020, Pat Doris put together a special report called Power Struggle that digs right into the issue.
As the former head of Bonneville Power Administration, Steve Wright probably knows more about electricity and the Northwest power system than anyone else. So when he sounded concerned, it caught my attention.
Headed towards zero over the course of certainly the next 5 to 10 years.
And when that goes to zero, will there be enough power to replace it?
Well, I think that's what this conference is about, is that our forecasts say that we're going to have significant problems.
Stay with me now. This part's going to get a little bit technical. Part of the concern comes from thousands of computer simulations run by an organization called the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. Part of their job is to look out into the future and predict whether we'll run out of electricity during a worst-case scenario.
Remember, the coal plant retirements take that enormous amount of dependable electricity out of the system. That significantly raises the danger that there will not always be enough power. Here are the numbers they found. On the conservative side, their simulation found a 26% chance we could run out in the year 2026. A more aggressive simulation found a 33% chance we run out in the year 2024. Either way, both are shockingly high numbers that should grab your attention.
With that 30% probability, 1 out of 3 times when these scenarios are run, it runs into trouble?
Yes.
Is that what that means?
Yes. And that is pretty much unprecedented.
And that's only 6 years from now.
Yeah, it's coming up pretty fast. And in our world, when it takes a long time to build generating resources, to put in place demand response programs, to build transmission, yeah, we are quite concerned about whether we have enough time to be able to address this issue.
To make up for the lost power from coal, the big utility companies are building new wind farms and solar plants, or contracting to buy power from outside sources, along with experimenting with ways to change the way that we use electricity, trying to lower demand. If a utility really runs into trouble, many plan to simply buy excess electricity from other power generators on the open market. But that plan has one big flaw. If everyone does the same thing at the same time, it could wipe out the supply. It's sort of like a lot of homeowners and an approaching storm. Everyone goes to the same few stores to buy generators, but pretty soon the stores are empty, and some folks get left in the dark. It could result in skyrocketing prices for electricity, or something the Northwest has not experienced in modern time: rolling blackouts.
If you want to watch Pat's full power struggle documentary, you can find it right now on the KGW Plus app, our free Roku and Fire TV app, or you can also find it on the KGW YouTube channel. It is certainly worth the watch. Okay, we want to talk now about a scary situation for a couple of people in Southeast Portland when they say a man attacked them out of nowhere. They tell us he was on a bike and they were inside a car when they say he approached them and smashed their windshields. After all that, police did not arrest him. Let's bring in Mike Benner now. He's been talking with the people involved in this. And Mike, I cannot even imagine how terrifying that must have been for them.
Yeah, extremely terrifying, Christine, because both these drivers were simply minding their own business. One guy says the man approached on a bike and threw a rock at his windshield. A second person, a woman, says the man on the bike pulled up right next to her and repeatedly hit her windshield with a bottle. She tells me glass went everywhere, all over the dashboard, all over her arms, and into the folds of the dress she was wearing. Here's what else she had to say.
One of my biggest concerns is I have a teenage daughter who just started driving, and something like that to happen to a new driver would be devastating. It was thousands of dollars of damage to my car, but more importantly, it was a truly violent, completely unprovoked assault. I didn't feel like this was a property crime to me. This felt like a personal attack on me, that he looked at my face, into my eyes, and was violently hitting my car right where my face was. And, you know, I can only think of all the terrible things that could have happened.
Wow. Okay, so to make sure we understand this right, too, this guy who was involved was only cited, not arrested. Why?
You know, I wish I could tell you, Christine, but police have not said. All they're saying is they've cited Robert Casey McClatchy for second-degree criminal mischief, and he's been ordered to appear in court, a place McClatchy has been before. He's got a criminal history that dates back 2 decades. He's been busted for things like harassment, assault, and burglary. And just maybe that explains why McClatchy is now living on the streets.
Okay, so, you know, we have heard of violence like this really happening all over Portland. And I know, Mike, you've covered a whole lot of these types of stories. What is your takeaway?
Well, first and foremost, it is sad. It is sad that more and more people appear to be getting involved in situations like this, and that we can't all just live peacefully. And that leaves a really bad taste in your mouth, right? And as one of the victims told me, it sometimes feels like the criminals in Portland have more rights than the people keeping our city alive.
Wow, not really mincing words there. Mike, you know, after reporting on this story and many others, have you been able to zero in on any solutions?
You know, unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of situation. When things like this happen, you hope police can do something about it. For whatever reason, though, they went the citation route. So this guy is still on our streets. And that brings up Portland's street response. Should they have been brought in on this? Well, they respond to non-violent calls involving people in a mental health crisis. First of all, this was not a non-violent call. This was a violent situation. And second, we don't know if this guy was experiencing a mental health crisis. For all we know, he's clear of mind and intentionally trying to terrorize people. So this is a tough one. There is no clear solution, and I think that is what is so frustrating to so many Portlanders. Christine?
Yeah, Mike Benner, thank you so much for your insight.
Up next on the story, rent in Oregon could go up by more than 14% next year. That's despite a rent cap law that was touted as first in the nation protection for tenants. But there's a little known resource for renters in Portland that could force your landlord to help pay for you to move if rent soars too high. We'll explain when the story returns.
According to Oregon's Community Alliance of Tenants, over 40% of households in Oregon are renters. And if you fall into that category, you probably want to pay close attention to this story. This week, the state announced landlords could raise rent next year by 14.6%. Believe it or not, that's in line with a law passed 3 years ago that promised to cap rent increases. The cap is calculated at 7% plus the consumer price index measure of inflation. And with inflation soaring, to many people, that law certainly feels like it's failing the people it was meant to protect. It's important to note that this cap applies to housing that's at least 15 years old. Newer rentals are not a part of it. For context, a one-bedroom apartment in Portland going for $1,500 a month now could have rent increased to over $1,700 if the landlord instituted the maximum increase. We heard from the president of the Portland Area Rental Owners Association, who believes most landlords will not raise rent by that maximum threshold, but don't expect your rent to stay stagnant either.
The way it's set up right now is if you're a landlord, you're a business. And if your costs go up, just like at your restaurant, or the Home Depot, when they had to pay more for the materials that they sell, they charged the end user more.
But there is a very valuable resource that's going largely unnoticed by tenants, and this only applies for those of you renting in the city of Portland. According to the Portland Housing Bureau, if your rent increases more than 10% next year, you can request what's called mandatory renter relocation assistance. That means your landlord has to help pay for you to move if you want out. Here's a look at how much your landlord would have to pay you depending on the size of your current unit. For a studio, it's $2,900, a one-bedroom $3,300, two-bedroom jumps up to $4,200, and anything 3 bedrooms or larger would be a $4,500 payment. But there are some exceptions to the rule that you really need to be aware of. Like I said earlier, you have to live within Portland city limits, you cannot live with your landlord, and your lease needs to be month to month or longer, like a 1-year agreement, for instance. You can't have like a week-to-week agreement. If your landlord is actively serving in the military and you're renting their home during their tour of duty, you don't qualify. And if there's a reason you're being evicted, what's called a for-cause termination, you do not qualify for mandatory renter relocation assistance. And again, this is only if your rent goes up by more than 10% and you want to move out. If you want to stay where you are now, you'll have to pay whatever the rent increase is, which could be up to that 14.6% that's allowed by state law. For some historical perspective, though, the average rent increase for apartments covered by the rent cap law has only gone above 10% once, and that was way back in 2015. I guess not way back, but back then. That's according to a 2019 report the company CoStar put together for KGW. But again, that report only looks at averages, so really, there were certainly a number of tenants hit with increases of more than 10% that year. If you have questions about mandatory renter relocation assistance, take a look at your screen, because you can contact the help desk at the city's rental services office by calling 503-823-1303 or by sending an email to rentalservices@portlandoregon.gov. Still ahead on the story, the Oregon Trail is certainly something you probably learned about in school, or maybe you played that really popular computer game to get familiar. But would you ever think about making the trip today on foot? One Oregon man recently finished the trip. Find out why and how he did it next. We all know it. Oregon is outdoorsy. It's a hiking destination with people really coming from all over the country to enjoy the nature and outdoors of the Pacific Northwest. But back in the 1800s, that's not really what drew hundreds of thousands of pioneers out west. Now, a pioneer of a different sort is trying to revive the Oregon Trail's place in history. Catherine Cook shows us how.
When you hear Oregon Trail, you might think low-tech covered wagons. But for Don Martin, covering the 2,000-mile stretch from Missouri to Oregon City is more than an old video game.
It was time to do the whole trail.
It's a dream realized. Don, who lives in Prineville, set off in April and hiked the whole thing in 3 months. Just don't offer him a pat on the back for it.
Tens of thousands of 8-year-olds made this trip, and most of them did it barefoot. And that kind of puts what I did in perspective. It was hard, but it wasn't that hard.
On his journey, Don traveled alone, except for his homemade supply wagon named Ollie and a stuffed ox. Ollie, Ollie, oxen-free. Get it?
But he rode on top. He didn't pull it.
Weather permitting, Don camped under the stars. During storms and high wind, he hunkered down in motels. He saw what high winds did to this irrigator. And then there were moments like these, coming round a bend to see the first good view of Mount Hood and seeing rock formations in Nebraska like Scotts Bluff.
And for a lot of the people who came from farms in the Midwest, they had never seen anything like this in their lives. This was magical to them. And it's still magical today. So the remarkable thing is, why is it so hard today? And why have we forgotten it so completely?
You can still see wagon ruts in some spots, but most of the Oregon Trail is gone, turned into roads or plowed over. And unlike the Appalachian and Pacific Crest trails, there are few guides for the Oregon Trail. Don knows of less than a dozen people who've hiked it in recent decades. He wants that to change.
One of the things that I'm doing is trying to put together a trail guide for people who might want to do the same thing and reconnect with the experience of the pioneers that made the whole Western United States possible.
And while shoes these days are softer and the roads much more firm, Don believes the key to crossing the Oregon Trail remains largely unchanged.
Then and now was simply putting one foot in front of another for 2,000 miles and not stopping until you got to the end.
Catherine Cook, KGW News.
Gosh, he makes it sound so easy. So Don was clearly prepared for his hike. He spent 30 years in the Navy and has made other 2,000-mile treks before, but this one, obviously a unique journey. If you want to learn more about his adventure, he did document it in a trail blog. We have a link on kgw.com. When we come back, we're going to let you know how you can help deserving students in our area make it to college. That beat, you know what it means. This week for our Hey Help campaign, we are highlighting Minds Matter Portland. Each week, they work with a small group of highly motivated high school students who have the desire to attend four-year schools, but lack the money needed. If you'd like to help, open up your camera function on your phone and hover it right there over the QR code on your screen to donate directly to them. Even a couple bucks will help send some deserving students to summer college programs around the country and set them up for success after graduation. Well, that's it for us tonight here on The Story. Thank you so much for watching.